Hello, I've continued to read The Lord of the Rings, and now I'm in the last 5 chapters of the first half of The Two Towers, i.e., what is called Book 3 in a one-volume edition like the one that I've been reading. This one. As I suspected might be the case, there's a lot less of the Old English and Old Norse stuff by this point. So even though I read 5 chapters for this part, I don't think this will be a particularly long video. Alright, so as long as the Rohirrim are around, there's going to be some Old English names and things like that to comment on. There are 3 mountains called Three Hirna, which means 3 horns, and actually the first time that it's mentioned, it is mentioned that they are, quote, 3 jagged horns staring at the sunset, so it kind of gives it away. There's this fellow, Erkenbrand, who is a leader of the Rohirric warriors. He's the one who in the book actually kind of comes to save everybody at the end in Helm's Deep, a position that's given to some elves in the movies. The book's version of it is probably a little bit more satisfying as being a little bit less of a deus ex machina because they know he's out there, they just have to go and find him. Brand is very common in Old English and Old Norse names. Its original meaning, as you might be able to kind of tell from the shape of the root, is like a torch, but because a sword burns in the hand, right, reflects light, it comes to mean sword, especially in poetic language. That Erican part, I feel like there's something at the tip of my tongue there, and I've been digging around and trying to figure out what it is. It's strange when a word looks familiar to you, and yet you can't quite put your finger on it. It looks like it would be Old English Erican or something. I'm just going to look one more time at Bosworth Thaler online and see if that's there. No, it isn't. I would think it would be Old Norse Jarken, which again, it feels like it's something that's just barely scratching at the edge of my memory. I wonder if this is, if the reason why it's something it feels like it's scratching at my memory without quite getting there is because this is a calc on an old High German name or something. Surely I'm a moron and someone will point out exactly what it is. But for some reason I can't quite get to what the Erican part of the name is. He's also a person from Westfold, that is some area of Rohan. Of course, the first thing I think of is, oh, well, that's actually a part of Norway, right? Norway has the Vestfold and the Østfold. I don't know if Tolkien just liked the sound of that and imported that, or perhaps that's a place name in parts of England too. But if you know Scandinavia, it's hard not to think of I think Tønsberg is part of Vestfold. We also have a person whose name is Ceorl, Ceorl. That would be the Old English pronunciation. Of course, that's the ancestor of modern English churl, and its Old Norse cognate, Carl, of course, is the source of our name, Carl. It just means, freeman in Old English or Old Norse. Tolkien uses a lot of geographical terms here that I find very archaic. What is a coomb? Coomb. What is a deep? Deep, right? What is Helm's Deep? I'm not entirely. And what is a wide green gore? Gore. As someone who's spent a lot of my life in mountainous environments, it's interesting to see an Englishman from an environment that is not very mountainous at all use a lot of terminology for mountainous environments that I've never heard in my life. And of course, we see that when the Rohirrim talk among themselves, they use a lot of pretty archaic English. Theoden asks, quote, "Has aught been seen of Gandalf?" Off quote, AUGHT. old word for anything. It's the positive form of not, N-A-U-G-H-T, nothing. He asks, quote, whether Erkenbrand be there or no, off quote. That's the subjunctive use of be, right? Showing probably less confidence in the notion that Erkenbrand is there than if he'd used the indicative is. And then some other just archaic language they use, like foeman, rick cotton tree, the host for the army, etc. So I think pretty clearly Tolkien means for the Rohirrim to speak pretty old-fashioned English, even when they're using modern English. We have a few more Old English words. Gamling is the name of an old man at Helm's Deep. Of course, anyone who speaks a Scandinavian language recognizes gamel, old. That's the typical word for old in the Scandinavian languages. It existed in Old English, but was a more poetic word in Old English. It's funny how two different closely related languages can pick among two variations of a word and pick different ones. English goes with old, Scandinavian goes with gamel. But obviously gamling basically just means old guy. There's a bigger deal made in the book than ever is in the movies. In fact, I don't know if these guys really even show up in the movies, about the humans that Saruman hires to assist the orcs in their attacks on the Rohirrim. To me, that's a little bit more interesting. It plays more into the deeps of all of the interacting peoples and histories in Middle-earth, instead of just having, big green orcs fighting human people. There's humans who take a different side from other humans. It's more interesting. I sometimes wonder, and there are a few quotes later that made me wonder if he is sort of trying to make them like the Celts, that the English, the Rohirrim, like Old English speakers, replaced or overrode in Britain. I don't know. That story may sound better to mid-20th century J.R.R. Tolkien than it would to people in the 2020s reflecting on what a bloody displacement that probably was. But I can't really tell. He certainly doesn't want to hit you over the head with such parallels if he's going for them. We get another really archaic use of a word this time from Legolas, who says, quote, "Yet I make my tale 20 at the least," off quote. Of course, he's using tale to mean number. It's a very archaic use of the word tale. It does originally mean that, right? Tally retains that archaic sense of number. When you tell, originally that's you count. All right, that's what it means in Old Norse, for example, at telja. So what you have told is originally what you have recounted, right? The same metaphor that we use in modern English with the borrowed Romance word count. I note that the humans from Dunland, Gamling knows some of their language, and he talks about some of the things they're saying. They say death to the Strawheads, death to the Forgoil, F-O-R-G-O-I-L. Some of the place from is he trying to make them sound kind of Celtic? Because it sounds a little Celtic to me. But then again, Sindar in the Elvish language is supposed to sound kind of Welsh, so it's not as if Tolkien seems to have an axe to grind against Celtic speakers. I don't know, just things that occurred to me as I read through this. I thought toward the end of the Battle of Helm's Deep there was a very saga-like description of Theoden, quote, "And with that shout the king came. His horse was white as snow, golden was his shield, and his spear was long," off quote. Now, kind of dramatic. It tells you a bunch of things you already know, right? He has a long spear, his golden shield, he's a white horse. But that kind of description often precedes the fall of a character in an Icelandic saga, right? I used to tell students in my Icelandic sagas classes, UCLA or Berkeley or Colorado, as soon as you see the protagonist of the saga described in detail, he's about to die, right? Because this is sort of setting us up to imagine more richly his grand fall I think of Gunnar and Jarl Saga, I think of Gisli and Gisli Saga. So actually seeing that detailed description gave me pause as someone who had seen the movies and read these books 100 years ago, and thought, does Theoden die in the book? Because it just felt so much like the way that kind of death is set up in a saga. I wonder if Tolkien was going for that. Of course, he couldn't count on all of his audience to have that expectation, but it created that expectation wonder in me. I'll be back. Let me talk about chapters 8 to 11. Probably have less to say about those than I did about 7 after a quick word from my friends and partners at Grandfrost. So now this chapter 8, the road to Isengard. Would Tolkien have wanted to say Isengard? That would be the Old English. I don't know. There's not much here that attracted my attention as an Old English or Old Norse guy. Gimli waxing rhapsodic about how awesome the caves are underneath Helm's Deep, and Legolas waxing rhapsodic back at him about how lovely the forests of Fangorn are, reminded me a little bit of, say, Njordr and Skadi and the Prose Edda, with Njordr longing for the sea and his wife Skadi longing for the mountains, and their respective dislike of each other's environments. So I thought, is there some very distant allusion to that in the platonic relationship of Legolas and Gimli? I don't know. It's probably too much. There is a new Rohirric name, Helm, right? It's pretty transparent. But it's a little bit funny that living in a world with elves, they still give names that have elf in them. Of course, there's quite a few names with elf in European languages that we don't think about very much, right? Alfred, Elf Council, or it's Spanish form Alfredo. Alfonso, right? All these elf and elf names we don't really think about do contain the word elf. So, the top of Orthanc is, quote, written with strange signs, off quote. I wonder what signs are strange to a company that includes Gandalf, right? Can Gandalf read them, right? Who made this tower? Actually, the tower itself is described as a really interesting place that no one seems to know very much about in the story, and even apparently Sauron can't do anything to destroy. It's kind of interesting, right? I mean, it seems almost more like a 2001 Space Odyssey obelisk than anything else. I thought that was intriguing, and I didn't feel like that much intrigue about it survived into the movie. We see Orthanc. I mentioned in a previous video what its name means in English, or Rohirric from a Tolkien perspective. Tolkien actually calls this out. He says, quote, "This was Orthanc, the citadel of Saruman, the name of which had, by design or chance, a twofold meaning. For in the Elvish speech, Orthanc signifies Mount Fang, but in the language of the Mark of old, the cunning mind," off quote. So, yeah, pretty much gives the Old English meaning there, something like cunning mind. And when Theoden first meets the hobbits, he calls them by an Old English or Rohirric name, Hol Bidlan, Hol Dwellers. And then when Pippin says, "Hobbits, if you please, Lord," he says, quote, "Your tongue is strangely changed," off quote. So, of course, he's calling out the relationship between Rohirric and the common speech that's similar to the relationship between Old English and Modern English. Then we have chapter 9, Flotsam and Jetsam. Probably even less to say here. There's a quote that appealed to me. Aragorn says, quote, "One who cannot cast away a treasure at need is in fetters," off quote. Of course, I wonder if we're supposed to be thinking about Frodo when he says that, but also just a good quote. One thing that occurred to me as I was reading through all these chapters is how much of this is conversation, right? I mean, the movies, justifiably so, the movies, right? The visual spectacles emphasize the drama and the action, but there's so much of these books that's just people talking to each other, and it kind of works because the characters are persuasively portrayed as very different people. You feel like what Gimli says is something Gimli would say, right? You feel like something Pippin says is something Pippin would say. Tolkien is good at painting his characters, and this sort of thing is much harder to do, I think, on a movie screen where we want, you know, more of the axe swinging stuff. In chapter 10, The Voice of Saruman, we get, I think, well, for one thing, we get a nice picture of why Christopher Lee was chosen to play this character, because he has the kind of voice that Saruman is described as having. Saruman and Gandalf's interaction is interesting. I still feel like we don't have a lot of clarity about what a wizard is. And yes, I know there's more lore about this in books like The Silmarillion and probably in the appendix to this, but just for someone reading this book for the first time, or even for me reading it for what's effectively the first time, I look at this interaction between them and I wonder, you know, what are they talking about, right? I mean, it's undescribed background, and maybe, again, that's something kind of masterful on the part of Tolkien. He lets you believe that there's all this background back there, and whether or not he's even written it, and I guess he probably had written it at this point, even though no one had seen it, he makes you feel the depth of background material that he's written, even though he's not showing it to you. It's impressive. Then the last chapter in the first half of The Two Towers is the Palantir. This chapter is full of philosophical chestnuts, some of which I think are appealing. Of course, you know, my statements on philosophy are not of interest in particular. There was one phrase that stuck out to me for a long time. I mean, I remember this from reading this book the very first time that I ever read it. And I read The Fellowship of the Ring and The Return of the King in probably 1997, and then read the whole book, all three books, in 2006. I think, yeah, it would have been spring of 2006 when I had pleurisy and I had nothing better to do than learn strong verbs and read The Lord of the Rings. But this phrase from Gandalf, quote, "the burned hand teaches best," off quote, that line appealed to me so much that it stuck with me, and I've often found myself repeating it even when that is the last line I will forget from The Lord of the Rings, apparently. The whole quote is great, as Gandalf talks to Pippin about how he touched the Palantir when he knew that he shouldn't. Quote, "You knew you were behaving wrongly and foolishly, and you told yourself so, though you did not listen. I did not tell you all this before, because it is only by musing on all that has happened that I have at last understood, even as we ride together. But if I had spoken sooner, it would not have lessened your desire or made it easier to resist. On the contrary, no, the burned hand teaches best. After that, advice about fire goes to the heart." It's, off quote, it's very well put, it's very true. And the burned hand teaches best also functions pretty well as just about a couplet of Fornir the Sog, or one line of Old English poetry, like in Beowulf. I could probably rephrase it in Old Norse and keep it as Fornir the Sog, something like Brenda Hond Kinir Betst, right? It's almost the same metrically even. So with Gandalf and Pippin riding toward Minas Tirith, and I guess Aragorn staying in Rohan for a while with Theoden, and with us not really knowing what's going on with Frodo and Sam, the first half of the two towers comes to a close. And so next time when I do one of these videos, I will do chapters 1 to 3 of quote-unquote book 4, i.e. the second half of the two towers. So I'll have a video with 1 to 3, 4 to 6, and then 7 to 10 of book 4. So that'll take 3 videos. Probably 3 weeks at the rate that I'm putting these up. All right, well, I appreciate you folks. Remember that if you're interested in getting a copy of The Lord of the Rings or anything else, any of my books perhaps, there's an Amazon shop where you can do so directly. I have a crowdfunding project that I've recently announced on BackerKit where I am working on doing the Poetic Edda entirely in runes. A project that strikes me would appeal to J.R.R. Tolkien. I feel like that is something that he and I could smoke a pipe and talk about together, right? It just seems like something that he would do or find interesting or worth doing. So that's slightly amusing. All right, appreciate you on Patreon. Appreciate you folks tuning in for these. And for now, for beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.